All right, welcome to module number 3, the shutter speed. It might get a little confusing because on the next module 4, I introduced the lens as module number 3. So I didn't go back and fix that. I didn't want to re-record or do editing. So in any case, they're in the right order. Shutter speed's 3 and the lens is module number 4. So welcome to module number 3. So we've talked a lot about the camera, and we talked a lot about the controls, and now we're going to break them down one by one and really get into why we would want to take control of the shutter speed. Why would we want to set it manually? Why would we want to determine the camera use a particular shutter speed, disregard to any other exposure controls? So we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of shutter speed. When we get to the lens, we'll talk about how aperture and focal length relate to the same kind of things as tools in how we make photographs. So the shutter speed is a measurement of time. How much time that the light is exposed to the sensor. How much time the shutter opens and the light's allowed to transmit through the lens and hit the sensor. This is a very accurate measuring device. It can be from seconds. Most cameras go up to about 30 seconds as a longest exposure, and down to maybe 1/8,000th, 1/4,000th of a second for the short duration. So as you can see, it's a huge range. Shutter speeds are controlled in the camera body itself. So your shutter speed range will not change as you change lenses, as long as you maintain the same body. Some of the more prosumer bodies have a larger range. Some of the more consumer DSLRs may have a shorter range, or some of your rangefinders, more compact cameras, may not have quite the range of a professional DSLR, but that's kind of what you pay for with these new or with these more expensive cameras. There's really two kinds of shutters. There's a leaf shutter, and that's a series of blades that opens and closes. There's a focal plane shutter, as which we have in just about all of our DSLR, rangefinder kinds of cameras. Now, it may not be a physical focal plane, but it could be a electronic focal plane. And what that does is it basically, at certain shutter speeds, it opens up completely and then closes. And as we decrease the time, i.e. the shutter gets shorter and shorter and shorter, to maintain those incredibly fast shutter speeds, the focal plane shutter basically opens up a small slit, and then that slit moves across the sensor. So for all intents and purposes, every pixel is getting 1/8,000th of a second or 4,000th or whatever that is, because of the size of the slit moving across the sensor and the width of the slit. We'll see a little video later on, there's a video attached to this module that will give you some visuals of how that looks. All right, so a typical shutter speed sequence: 1 second over here, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 15th. You can see that these basically are just cutting in half. We miss it here. It should be 1/16th, but I think they wanted to keep it an even number. Then we went 30, 60, and then 125, which isn't exactly half, but it's close. And then 1/250. The next one would be 1/500th. The next one would be 1/1000th. On the other side, 1 second. The next longest shutter speed would be 2. Just double it. The next one would be 4, 8, blah, 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 and so on. Okay? So that's a typical sequence of shutters. Now, these are full stops, which means is when you go from 1/4 of a second to 1/8 of a second, you cut the time in half. When you go from 1/4 of a second to a half a second, you've doubled the time. Okay? Keep that in mind. Now, there are these little in-between shutter speeds, right? We're not going to concern ourselves with those for our sort of understanding of the shutter speed and how it works. Just too many numbers to remember. It's hard enough to remember these. Okay? But when you're playing with your camera, you may see other numbers pop up other than these full shutter speeds. But it's easier to talk about the relationship when we use a full stop, where we basically cut the light in half, or going the other way, we double the light. Oh, my friendly dog's barking. I knew that sooner or later, during one of our recordings, they would go crazy. I think that was the mailman, so sorry about that. A little bit in the background. Okay, and as I said, most cameras go from 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second, and then you have a B or a bulb setting on most of your cameras. You find that either by going all the way through the shutter speeds to 30 seconds, one more click goes to B, or there's a particular setting on the camera that'll get you B. And all that does is allow the shutter to be open as long as you have your finger on the shutter. So you can have the shutter open for an hour, 2, 3, 4, whatever, as long as you hold that button down. Okay? That's another way of extending the shutter speed. So why do we care? Right? Why do we care about shutter speed? What I want a picture. Right? So I just want the camera to make a decent exposure so I can see a resemblance of what I saw with my eyes, and I can take it and show it to my friends or put it on Instagram or do whatever I want to do with it. Okay? Well, the reason why you're in this class is because you want to understand how these things work and how you can maximize the camera to see like your eye, and then of course your eye creating an interesting composition, and then the camera follow that aesthetic. Okay? So here's a really good example. Over on the left, we have 1/800th of a second. So as you can see, the water is pretty sharp. Every little ball of water is frozen. You can see right above this rock up here, all those little particles of water, all the little specular highlights made by that water. And then we start going to a slower shutter speed. This is taking 1 second and breaking it 800 parts and using one of those. This is taking a second and breaking it into 30 parts and using one of those. So look what happens to our water here now. Look at how it kind of flows. Looks a little bit more liquid, right? Looks a little bit more maybe how we see it with our eyes. Okay? And then going to an extreme, 4 seconds, which is much longer, and look at how the water becomes just like cotton candy or like smoke. Can't tell any detail in there at all. Of course, the rocks are still sharp because the camera's on a tripod and it's not moving. The only thing that's moving is the water. So if you were out shooting a small stream or a river or something like that, you have a choice of shooting it at 1/800th of a second, 1/30th of a second, or 4 seconds. You can make this look any one of these three. Your camera probably will choose somewhere in between these two on automatic. But you, in fact, can choose the water that's completely stopped in action, somewhat motion, or a bunch of motion. Our assignment for this week is going to be about motion, so I don't know exactly how it's going to time. We're going to have some motion exercises, so you'll have an opportunity to play with that. But remember now that because this rock is in focus in each one of these, it means that the camera's on a tripod and it's stable. Okay? And one more thing, I'm going to throw this out here now, and we'll talk about that more in the next module, is as you change the shutter speed and you make it longer, 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 you then have to take the aperture, which is in the lens, and make it smaller, smaller, smaller. We have a very long exposure time, so we need to have a small opening. We have a middle exposure time, a medium opening, and then a very fast time, a larger opening. So this is when we're going to start talking about equivalent exposure. Okay, short or fast shutter speeds. Okay, now we're talking about freezing action. Freezing the drops on this Corona bottle as the drop is coming down and splashing on the top. Precisely that moment when the drop before it hit and made that little crown. Freezing the action. Dropping a penny into some water with a blue background and freezing that action. We're seeing things in here that we can't normally see because we can stop it and really study excuse me, the copper and the white and the blue and how they all merge together in some kind of crazy, almost blown glass kind of look. Oh, my dog's always good for a fun jump in the pool. Fast shutter speed, again stopping that motion, right, of that water coming in, and seeing it a little bit different. Fast or short shutter speed, stopping that water before it hits the ground. This isn't that fast of a shutter speed, but still, the Pelican's frozen in the air as it comes in for the landing in the Monterey Bay. Cruising along the surface, this is down in Salton Sea at sunset. You can see the beautiful golden color on the bird. And he's just cruising along, but that's also frozen. You can see the water here, frozen midair, surfer frozen. So fast shutter speed. Again, the Monterey Bay, the water hitting the rocks on a very angry, a day the sea was very angry. So here's a little bit slower, longer exposure, but this is kind of in between. Kind of like that water. Some of the objects in this photograph are still the heavier branches, but those poppies that are blowing in the wind have that little movement to them. So it's kind of one of those tweener shutter speeds. Longer exposure as the cars drive by, getting the lights trailing off into the frame. This is the light rail going through downtown. You get the movement of the lights inside the car, where the black windows are black. You don't have any disruption of the light over here. That's why it's kind of transparent and you can see through it. Some kids running around a mosque in Turkey, and all you heard was the pitter patter of their feet. So I wanted a little bit of blur, so we got some feet kind of sharp, but then the actual kids' bodies are all blurry. So this is a longer shutter speed. You can see the water is a little bit smoky like here. The clouds are pretty frozen, but mainly the water here is what's showing the longer exposure. It's soft and gentle right here. You can see that reflection is just soft, right? It's not sharp and hard. Again, these reflections of the lights in the water, when you have a long exposure as the water's rippling, it creates a little blur to that. You can also see some cars and blur back here, but mostly this is from the water. Long shutter speed on waterfall, and obviously the river that it's created, having that sort of smoothed out kind of look. Mono Lake, longer exposure. You can see the reflection of these tufa towers. They have a soft feel to them because it's a longer exposure, and as that water's rippling, even though it's pretty still, there's still light ripples, and so as it's rippling, the exposure is long enough to take these hard lines that would define the reflection of the tufa tower and actually soften them up a little. So here's an example of that too. Here's 1.6 seconds, House of Fine Arts in San Francisco. You can start seeing these lines in here, right? And then 13 seconds, look at that, they just go away. How smooth that is. So again, this is your choice as a photographer. What would you like to see? Do you want to see that reflection in the water define? Give it a little bit of energy? Give it a little bit of punch? Or do you want it to be smooth and soft and silky? One is not better than the other, it's just different. And once you understand how to use the f-stop and use the shutter speed and use ISO all together in unison, then you're able to make these kind of decisions on how you want that water to look. Or you want to try a few. You may want to be out in the field and shoot one at a second and shoot one at 10 seconds. Come back home, look at the screen, and decide which one you like better. But at least you have an idea of what you're doing out there in the field. Another in-between, shutter speed. The people are a little bit blurry. The girl's staring at me, so it's sharp. Kind of defines her a little bit amongst that group. Panning. We will do a panning exercise. So this is moving the camera with the subject, and the background and or the foreground become blurry because it's still, because the camera and the car are moving at the same pace. It's called panning. Lots of sports photographers use this technique to show speed and a little bit more defined picture of the car what they're photographing, and the back going a little bit blurrier out of focus so it's not too distracting. You can imagine that yellow canary in Toyota would be a lot more distracting if it was all sharp. Same with that wire fence in the foreground. In between shutter speed, the woman with the clarinet in the center being a little bit sharper, especially down by her hand and by the mid part of the clarinet, and everything else around is blurry. This isn't a Photoshop filter. This is just panning along with her with a wide angle lens, and those things in the center are sharper. Those things on the edges, because they're wide angle lens, it gets a little bit more blurry. Panning again, really in this photograph, the only thing that's in focus is the collar of the dog. Everything else is blurry. This isn't even completely sharp, but it shows motion, it shows energy. He's zipping across the parking lot, passing his brother, feeling like he's large and, and in control of everything, and so it gives it a little bit more energy when you can play with these shutter speeds, no matter what you're photographing. Whether it's a family photograph or whether it's something you're doing on assignment at a car race. Same technique, same result. You just have to know what shutter speed to use. How fast is the person moving? What focal length are you using? How good are you at panning? All those kind of things come into play. The great news is, back in the day when we shot film, you'd shoot these, you'd wait a week or a day or two to see if you got it right. At least here, you can shoot it, look at it, say, wow, everything's sharp. I'm going to slow down that shutter speed. And you slow it down, you go, oh, everything's out of focus. I'm going to take the shutter speed up a little bit, make it a little shorter. So we can make those kind of decisions in the moment, in the field, and hopefully maximize the use of the technique for the given subject. So this same thing, very little in focus except the front of that fender. We saw this image before from the day one PowerPoint. This is in the context of panning. Again, it has that interesting painterly quality on the leathers. So shutter speed, as regards to composition, it can show motion, it can show speed, drama, tension, power. It can draw attention to something, or it can create tension. You can focus on something, like the woman with the clarinet, by having everything else out of focus. And like it focuses on something, it can have a dominant subject and a less dominant subject by where the focus plane is. You get that fluid, painterly quality sometimes. That's a result of that softness or the blur, right? You can get rid of just it feels like it flows. It may be more gentle, maybe more relaxing, maybe more beautiful. The scarf flowing in the wind, that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of reasons why we'd want to take the shutter speed and then be able to control it to help get the message across in the photographs that we're trying to make, and have our viewer basically see what we're trying to convey. All right, so that does it for shutter speed. Next up will be the lens in the next module. Until then, have a great week.